Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore 19 shocking moments that shattered the lives of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. Let's revisit her journey from a humble minor noblewoman sent to study in France and then returning as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, to the moment she used her cunning to win the king's heart, sparking the break from the Roman Church and paving the way for an independent Church of England. But behind that glory lay merciless machinations, from her failure to produce a male heir to Thomas Cromwell's elaborate conspiracy that sent both of them tumbling into tragedy. This is a story of unchecked power, ruthless ambition, and a fierce love with consequences no one could foresee. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Where are you watching from? And what time is it local to you? Let me know in the comments now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 1536, the world watched one of the most shocking executions in England's history. Anne Boleyn, who had been Queen of England only 3 years earlier, stepped onto scaffold dressed in grey silk robes and a pristine white cap. Her nape shaved close. Even the floral patterns on her silk seemed to mourn, tightening like a noose as she faced the waiting blade. The scaffold stood beside the River Thames, candlelight flickering in the hazy night air, wind carrying a chill, and the metallic tang of dried blood. The crowd cheered, whether in anger or morbid curiosity. None could say, knowing only that King Henry VIII had resolved to rid his realm of this traitor. Previously, Anne had been accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. Every charge adultery, incest, conspiracy to murder the king was meticulously fabricated. The only evidence consisted of coerced confessions, while the trial itself played out like a drama whose ending had been written long before. Thomas Cromwell had scripted the scenario, extracting accusations from those tortured into admitting the impossible. As for Henry, once so enamoured of Anne that he had cast aside his lawful wife, he had now transformed into someone unrecognisable, ruthless, cold, determined to crush the past in order to assert absolute power. The fateful moment arrived when the sword glinted under the candlelight, revealing that Henry had not used the common executioner's axe, but had specially hired a swordsman from Calais. In that era, the axe symbolized stern justice, whereas the sword signified clemency to the vanquished. Henry's choice to spare Anne the axe and grant her a merciful beheading was widely whispered as his final act of compassion for the woman who had been his wife, his second great love. Yet that very detail only deepened the tragedy. The last mercy proved itself a solemn formality, incapable of erasing the stain of injustice. Witnesses would later recall that, as Anne knelt on the wooden platform, she retained her courage. No sigh escaped her lips, only the sound of grey silk cascading as the sword swept through the air. Moments later, she collapsed, silent forever. The crowd fell into stunned silence, as though awed by the cruelty hidden within the royal heart. Candle smoke swirled around her head, mingling with the cold night mist, creating a scene both majestic and mournful. As for Henry, the candlelight seemed to outline every crease on his brow, a testament to a man petrified by power. He watched the bloodied blade, then turned and strode toward his lit palanquin, the air thick with smoke and defiance. No words of apology or remorse were heard, only the echo of his footsteps on the cold stone floor, as if climbing a fateful staircase into a new era, an age severed from the Roman Church, in which he would proclaim himself head of the Church of England. Anne Boleyn's tragic death did more than end her own life. It heralded a religious upheaval greater than any personal trial. Her hurried funeral took place in the dead of night, without drums or trumpets, only a few whispered prayers before her remains were buried in an unmarked grave. That final mercy, her sword execution, proved the closing note of a power drama, Henry's way of declaring that anyone who dared stand in his path would pay the direst price. Can you imagine that night? When cold mist embraced the scaffold, wind whistled along the stone walls, and the figure in grey silk faded into the darkness. Destiny for a woman who had once captivated a king's heart, only to be cast aside by him. In that haunting twilight, a reminder echoed endlessly, no matter how great the power. Human remain finite, and a victor's last mercy can be nothing more than a veneer for nameless cruelty. Anne Boleyn was born around 1501 into a lesser noble family in England and was sent to study in France while still in her teens. In the refined courts of the Netherlands and France, she absorbed their sophisticated culture. She learned to speak multiple languages fluently, to dance with grace, and most dangerously to think for herself. When she returned to England in 1520, she took up the role of lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Though she was neither strikingly beautiful, nor wealthy, nor influential, Anne impressed everyone by her confidence, her quick intelligence, and her charming conversational style, so unlike the quiet, submissive comportment expected of English women at the time. By 1525, Henry VIII was just 34, still in fine health. Athletic and handsome when he chose to be, he attended a court dance where Anne served as a maid among many, and his attention was immediately captured. His sister-in-law, Mary Boleyn, had once been his mistress and quietly accepted that role. By contrast, Anne carried herself with a proud reserve that made her unapproachable, a challenge he found irresistible. At that time, Anne was betrothed to Henry Percy, heir to one of the most powerful northern families, a match offering significant political and financial advantage. Yet Henry VIII, when determined, had his way. He commanded his chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey, to dissolve Anne's engagement to Percy. Under pressure, Percy was forced into marriage with another, and thus Anne embarked on a perilous struggle for her future. During this phase, Henry's love letters to Anne, preserved in the Vatican archives, reveal a campaign of psychological warfare. He wrote of being struck by the dart of love, compared his pursuit to a military conquest, and described Anne as his prize. Despite the flattery, Anne refused to yield. She accepted his gifts, but kept him at arm's length. She danced with the king, but did not share his bed. The frustration only fueled his obsession, driving him to pursue her more relentlessly. Yet Anne's ambition was never merely personal. She understood that as a wife, and especially as a mother of a son, she would secure her position and safety. In Tudor England, a queen's primary duty was to produce a male heir. Anne's strategy rested on this brutal calculus: she would not become Henry's mistress, for that would only end in obscurity once he grew tired. Instead, she would insist on marriage, knowing full well the danger she courted. Her refusal to surrender her body until marriage represented a daring gamble that could, and ultimately did, cost her everything. Behind her cool exterior, Anne carefully maneuvered. She cultivated alliances at court, aligning herself with reform-minded courtiers who saw in her the embodiment of England's future religious independence. She engaged Henry in learned theological debates, showing him books by continental reformers, slyly encouraging the notion that kings drew their authority directly from God. Bypassing Rome, every conversation, every gift accepted, and anonymous gift refused, became part of her wider game of power. Henry, meanwhile, grew more and more enraptured by Anne's blend of intellect and willfulness. To him, the slipperiness of her affection magnified its value. He pursued not just a woman, but a mystery to be solved. He showered her with jewels, titles, and promises, calling her "my sweetheart," and signing missives with heart symbols around her initials. But he remained entirely convinced that, once he had bent her to his will, She would gladly become his wife and mother to his children. Anne played the role of coy enchantress. Aware that her green-eyed refusals only heightened his desire, it was a game of power at its most intimate and most dangerous. Anne knew that one misstep, one too bold jest, or one too harsh refusal could provoke Henry's wrath. She recognized that the king's favor was as lethal as any weapon in his armory. Yet she persisted, using every ounce of wit and courage at her disposal. Her eyes shone with determination when she spoke of her desire to be queen. And Henry, intoxicated, pressed on. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey found himself caught between his duty to the papacy and the king's demands. He faltered, until Anne's growing influence finally helped tilt Wolsey's allegiance. In the hush of candlelit corridors, Anne applauded her faith. She corresponded in code, consulted sympathetic chaplains, and prepared the ground for her ascent. With each secret meeting, Henry's resolve hardened. He became convinced that divine providence demanded this union. He interpreted setbacks at Rome as confirmation that the Church was conspiring against his rightful desire for a male heir. And so, with Anne's subtle encouragement, he pressed for annulment of his marriage to Catherine, a move that would unleash forces none could contain. Thus began the most perilous act of their shared drama. Anne's insistence on marriage not as a mere consolation prize, but as her crowning achievement. She saw the silver lining as queen. She would secure a dynasty, protect her own life, and define the future of the realm. But she could not know how ruthlessly Henry would turn against her if she failed to deliver a son. The quiet confidence and brilliant mind that had drawn him in would one day fuel his justifications for her destruction. And so, in the silent watches of countless nights, Anne and Henry played their lethal game one side, scheming to obtain, the other maneuvering to withhold until the final commitment was made. Later, each diplomatic move, each forbidden glance was a pawn in a larger contest of wills. Neither could foresee how the stakes would escalate, nor how the promise of a crown and a throne would one day give way to the scaffold and the severed head. But for now, in the flickering torchlight of their shared ambition, they remained locked in a dance of power from which neither could easily escape. Around 1527, Henry VIII finally abandoned any hope of keeping Catherine. He convinced himself that marrying his sister-in-law was forbidden by divine law, especially after 16 years of union that had produced only one surviving child, the Princess Mary. Driven by his devout Christian beliefs, he sought an annulment from the Holy See, technically a declaration that his first marriage was null and void. Yet Pope Clement VII found himself trapped between the demands of the English king and the formidable influence of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, Catherine's nephew. For 6 long years, the annulment process dragged on. Bogged down by papal politics and imperial pressure, Henry grew increasingly impatient. As each passing season saw no resolution, Anne, however, remained composed. Understanding the stakes of her own strategy, she dared not allow herself to be alone with the king in a way that might lead to conception before their marriage was sanctified. Any child born out of wedlock would be branded illegitimate and denied succession, so she maintained her distance, accepting gifts and dances but avoiding the king's bed, all the while waiting for Rome to relent. By early 1532, Henry's patience had worn thin, and Anne was past the age of 30, a milestone that Tudor England regarded as old for an unmarried woman. In the hush of Dover Castle's private chapel, they exchanged vows in secret one moonlit dawn. Anne conceived almost immediately. The news carried on hushed, whispers through court corridors. For Anne, the pregnancy was reassurance. For Henry, it was proof of divine favor, a token he believed would convince Rome to grant his wish. Not until May of 1533 did the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, render a judgment in Henry's favor, declaring his marriage to Catherine invalid. Anne Boleyn was at last crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The procession through London's streets glittered with gold thread and velvet, Yet beneath the pageantry lay widespread hostility. The English people, loyal to Catherine's piety and dignity, remained vocal in their disapproval. Hats were not raised, cheers were buried beneath murmurs of discontent. In this turbulent context, the Queen's title proved a double-edged sword. On one hand, it granted Anne unprecedented power. She sat at council meetings, influenced state policy, and enjoyed the king's intimate confidence. On the other, it cast her as the living emblem of the break with Rome when Henry proclaimed himself supreme head of the Church of England. The weight of that symbolism pressed down on Anne's shoulders every misstep. Every moment of perceived obstinacy could be construed as betrayal. Failure to produce a male heir would not just disappoint her husband, it would threaten her very existence. Anne navigated these perilous waters with cautious skill. She appeared at state functions with regal poise, conversed with ambassadors on matters of faith and diplomacy, and publicly endorsed the king's religious reforms. Yet her courtly influence sparked envy among conservative nobles and clergy, who still revered the old alliance with Rome. In whispers behind closed doors, they questioned her foreign upbringing, her Protestant sympathies, and her insistence on being seen as Henry's equal in intellect. Meanwhile, Henry watched his queen with fierce scrutiny. He showered her with jewels engraved with their initials, coiffed her hair with golden ornaments, and wrote her effusive love letters. But each birthday that passed without a son gnawed at his confidence. Anne's previous indiscretions in courtship, her strategic refusals and flirtatious dances, became ammunition for those plotting her downfall. To her enemy, her imperious bearing and vocal opinions now marked her as dangerously ambitious rather than charmingly witty. Thus, the throne Anne had so precariously claimed became the very trap into which she would fall. The mantle of queen, heavy with expectation, and crowned by the king's break with tradition, left no margin for error. A queen's primary duty in Tudor England was to secure the succession. Anne's pregnancy did result in the future Queen Elizabeth, but not the much-desired prince. In a realm accustomed to male rulership, a daughter was not enough to satisfy Henry's urgent dynastic needs. In the hush of courtly rumour, those who opposed Anne began to gather proof, real or imagined, of her supposed failings. Every late attendance at church, every lingering smile with a favoured courtier, every hesitation before granting the king's advances became misinterpreted as signs of disloyalty or worse. The very same independence of mind that had once made her irresistible now seemed a threat to the king's absolute authority. As months turned into years, the shadow of suspicion grew darker. Anne's power, so carefully built through patience and cunning, stood on a knife's edge. Each council meeting she attended, each public gesture she made, was watched for flaw. The title of queen, once her greatest triumph, threatened to become her undoing. For in Tudor England, defying the king or failing his expectations meant courting disaster without defence. Living within the Tudor court was far from the sumptuous spectacle of movies and novels. It was more akin to a gilded prison, rife with disease, violence, and pervasive, invisible surveillance. Imagine walking through corridors where every garment you wore was soaked through with sweat and the lingering scent of menstrual blood. The rough linen underclothes chafing against skin already raw from hours of wear. Perfumes and pomanders offered little relief. Their sweet essences only thinly veiled the underlying musk of unwashed flesh. Public latrines opened directly over the castle's moats, allowing human waste to drip into the stagnant water below, bringing a stench so potent that courtiers often dreaded the chamber pots carried through the halls. Food, too, was perilous. Salted meats often clung to mould. Bread turned fuzzy within days. Milk soured into a thick curd that occasionally bore traces of blood or pus from diseased udders. It was no wonder that tooth decay and chronic stomach ailments crippled many by their 20s. And yet this was the environment in which Anne Boleyn had to assert her influence and protect her fragile position. In this world, Women were regarded as inherently inferior, subject to every prejudice of the era. Menstrual blood was feared as a corrupting agent capable of curdling milk, wilting flowers, and driving men mad. Female periodicity carried with it the taint of moral and physical impurity. Pregnancy and childbirth were equally fraught, with no knowledge of germ theory or antiseptics. Even the simplest delivery could become a death sentence. Many women perished from postpartum infection, hemorrhage, or uterine prolapse, their agonized screams echoing down the cold stone passages. Anne, acutely aware of these dangers, nonetheless chose to endure the rigors of pregnancy and labor in hopes of fulfilling her primary duty, providing a male heir. Each step toward motherhood was taken with equal measures of desperation and dread. For failure meant not only personal tragedy, but political annihilation. As if disease and the threat of physical demise were not enough, Henry VIII's extensive network of spies and informants ensured that no word or gesture went unmonitored. Letters thought to be private were intercepted and copied, then used as ammunition against their author. Servants and chambermaids, bribed or coerced, reported every intimate conversation, every sigh of complaint, every stolen glance between the Queen and her allies. Even the priests who heard confessions were expected to relay any politically relevant tidbit to the king ministers. Loyalty was a precarious commodity. Confidantes often became betrayers, complicit in the downfall of those they once served. Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, terrified for their own safety, supplied testimonies that would later be twisted into damning evidence against her. In these shadowy depths of Tudor intrigue, one could never be certain of friend or foe. Yet, under this crushing oppression, Anne continued to demonstrate remarkable fortitude and resolve. She lent her voice to Henry's religious reforms, advocating for measures that broke traditional ties to Rome. In private councils, she spoke passionately about policy, offering counsel on matters of state, and even engaging in delicate diplomatic negotiations with foreign emissaries. Her intelligence and energy, initially so captivating to the king, now presented a formidable challenge to his absolute authority. She was no longer a passive ornament, but a political actor whose ambitions demanded recognition. Every meeting she attended reinforced her influence. Yet each public declaration became a potential flashpoint for those eager to undermine her. Henry, who once found Anne's acumen intoxicating, began to see her assertiveness as disconcerting. He had fallen in love with the idea of an intellectual companion, a Renaissance-minded queen who would elevate his court's prestige. But once the mausoleum of papal authority had been shattered and his self-proclaimed supremacy established, he bristled at any reminder that she, too, possessed power and will. Her insistence on participating in governance became, in his eyes, an encroachment on his prerogative. He missed the demure acquiescence of his first wife, Catherine, whose dignity never eclipsed his own. Nor had she pressed him for counsel on matters beyond her domestic sphere. Anne's very presence in the inner sanctum of decision-making now felt like a reproach, proof that he had invited equality and found it intolerable. The Queen's dual role as both sovereign's consort and symbol of the English Church's independence rendered her especially vulnerable to her opponents. Her failures, most notably the absence of a male heir, were not misfortunes but indictments. They seized on every nuance of her conduct, late arrivals to Mass, animated debates with clerics, discreet smiles exchanged with reformist courtiers. Each became fodder for rumours of disloyalty, infidelity, or worse, conspiracies against the crown. Even her charitable acts, distributing alms to the poor, granting audience to petitioners, were twisted into suggestions of misplaced priorities, as though a queen had no business beyond fulfilling dynastic expectations. Thus, in this environment of filth and fear, Anne Boleyn navigated a landscape that demanded absolute compliance or exacted lethal retribution. Her every breath was measured, every word weighed, every gesture analysed for hidden meaning. Yet she persisted in her public duties, wearing her crown as both armour and burden. Determined to shape the realm's destiny alongside the king, she understood that her unique combination of intellect, beauty, and political savvy could never be wholly celebrated. It could only be feared, and in Tudor England, to be feared by the monarch was often to court one's own demise. By 1535, the hope had become a fragile thread for Anne Boleyn. She was pregnant for the third time, clutching at the possibility of finally presenting Henry with the long-awaited male heir. Each night she lay awake, listening to the distant drip of torches in the corridors, willing her body to carry the child safely through every agonizing contraction. But on the morning of January 29th, 1536 a day, forever marked by the death of Catherine of Aragon, Anne's hope collapsed. The pregnancy ended in miscarriage, a loss so profound that it drained the colour from her cheeks and left her limbs aching with grief and exhaustion. As the midwives gathered around the small, cold bed, murmuring prayers and fumbling with herbal poultices, Anne felt the walls of her world closing in. She watched the lifeless form of her unborn child, and with it died, her final claim to security in a court where a queen's worth was measured by her womb. In the days that followed, Henry's affections cooled in ways that cut deeper than any blade. Anne perceived, in every curt nod and distracted glance he offered, a retreat of love that once burned so fiercely. She felt his gaze turn again toward Jane Seymour, the king's newfound favourite, a gentle lady whose placid demeanour and meek obedience embodied everything a Tudor monarch expected of a queen. Jane's soft smiles and measured words contrasted starkly with Anne's spirited counsel and sharp wit. Anne's heart stung with bitter envy as she observed Jane glide through court functions, draped in pale silks, her every gesture invoking a serene virtue. Meanwhile, Anne's own presence seemed to irritate Henry more than delight him. Driven by a desperate need to reclaim his attention, Anne resorted to petty stratagems she would later regret. She offered private gifts to handsome courtiers, invited them to share confidential conversation in hushed corners, and lingered just a moment too long in the arms of gentlemen who sought her favour. She danced with Sir Henry Norris until her slippers wore thin, spoke laughingly with Francis Weston while the king watched from a distance, and arranged clandestine meetings where she allowed herself small comforts, a stray touch, a furtive compliment. In her mind, these acts were irreproachable charms, the harmless attempts to evoke the spark of jealousy that she hoped would reignite Henry's passion for her. Yet, in the kingdom's darker recesses, these same gestures would be contorted into damning evidence of her infidelity. Thomas Cromwell, the king's formidable chief minister, observed every misstep with calculating interest. He collected each letter Anne wrote in flowing script, each note she passed to an ally, and each jest she exchanged in the Queen's private chambers. He questioned Anne's former confidantes, weaving their recollections into incriminating narratives. Under torture, musicians and servants were coerced into confessing sensational liaisons, many imagined between the Queen and 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. Cromwell orchestrated this web of false testimony with terrifying precision. A misplaced caress became adultery. A friendly letter became proof of conspiracy. A whispered joke became evidence of treason. He curated these fragments into a seamless drama, each scene preordained to end in Anne's disgrace and death. By the summer of 1536, Anne's world had narrowed to the cold stones of the Tower of London and the steady drip of a single candle in her private cell. Cromwell's fabricated charges, adultery, incest, plotting, the king's murder hung over her like silent ravens. The instruments of law, once reserved for true criminals, now served as the king's blade. Through forged evidence and tortured confessions, Cromwell had transformed political calculation into judicial execution. Anne, who had once stood at Henry's side as his intellectual equal and royal partner, now awaited a fate prescribed by a script written in shadow. Her final act in this tragic play would be to defend herself against accusations so absurd that they defied reason, yet bore the king's seal and the weight of his decree. And so, in the hush before dawn on May 1st, 1536, Anne Boleyn's arrest was carried out with quiet ruthlessness. No trumpet heralded her downfall. No herald proclaimed her crimes beyond the thin walls of the Tower. The perfumed tapestries of her former chambers were stripped away, replaced by damp stone and the echo of her footsteps. In the days that followed, the trial, a spectacle of pretense, culminated in a verdict never in doubt. The Queen, once the vibrant star of Henry's court, was condemned by a jury of nobles who dared not defy the king's wishes. And in that final moment, when the blade was raised, all that remained was the hollow promise of mercy offered in the form of a sword rather than an axe before the darkness closed in forever. Early in 1536, Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's newly appointed, ever-scheming chief minister, received the king's unequivocal command: bring down Queen Anne Boleyn. There was no pretense of innocence. The target was clear. Cromwell set about his grim work with a languid, inexorable precision that belied his ruthless ambition. He wove a campaign of political degradation, exploiting every intimate connection Anne had forged with the male courtiers around her. Soft whispers in hidden corridors were recast as seditious conspiracies. Friendly letters, painstakingly intercepted by Cromwell's agents, became damning evidence of treachery. As the winter's chill settled over London, Cromwell's spies and interrogators moved through the court like silent phantoms, gathering testimony by any means necessary. First to bear the brunt was Mark Smeaton, a court musician whose gentle manners and simple loyalty had once endeared him to Anne. Under Cromwell's watchful eye, Smeaton was seized one damp evening and shackled to the rack in an inner chamber of the Tower. Day turned to night, and night to day, as the rack's relentless strain sapped his strength. Each confession, real or coerced, was recorded with meticulous care. Exhausted beyond measure, Smeaton finally yielded, uttering a heartbreaking admission that he had been intimate with the Queen. His voice, cracked and halting, echoed in the stone-walled room, and Cromwell's agents quickly transcribed every tortured syllable. In the dim candlelight, Cromwell's satisfaction was nearly imperceptible, a faint curl at the corner of his lip, as he marked another line in his dossier. Once Smeaton's confession was secured, Cromwell turned his attention to Anne's more prominent associates. Henry Norris, the groom of the stool and one of the king's most trusted courtiers, was quietly apprehended at dawn. Francis Weston and William Brereton were similarly seized. Each was accused of adulterous liaisons with the Queen. Even George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, was implicated in a scandalous charge of incest. Cromwell, ever the strategist, chose specific dates, moments when these men and Anne had inevitably crossed paths at banquets, jousts, or private audiences, and presented these coincidences as incontrovertible proof of illicit affairs. A courteous bow, a courteous gift exchanged in the twilight of the pre-chamber, a shared laugh over a musical performance, all were reframed as evidence of betrayal and conspiracy. Once the arrests were made, Cromwell ensured that the accused suffered in isolation. In the damp cells of the Tower of London, they endured bitter cold, meagre rations, and the crushing weight of uncertainty. Each day brought fresh demands. Name others. Confess again. Admit your guilt. The interrogators, following Cromwell's instructions, alternated threats of harsher treatment with hollow promises of mercy. Any sign of resistance was met with renewed brutality. Any concession was hastily recorded as further justification for the Queen's undoing. No independent witnesses were allowed, and no legal counsel could intercede. Cromwell's fabricated legal case took shape swiftly. Each forced testimony, another brick in his grim edifice. In just a few weeks, Cromwell's orchestration of vengeance reached its horrifying culmination. He assembled the charges into a formal indictment, shimmering with sensational claims of adultery, incest, and treason. He orchestrated a public outcry. Select courtiers and sympathetic nobles were quietly briefed, ensuring that once the trial began, there would be little dissent. Cromwell's aim was clear: he needed the court, and by extension the public, to see Anne's execution as a regrettable but necessary step. Only then could Henry remarry without hesitation, secure in the knowledge that a new queen would produce the male heir whose absence had haunted his reign. Anne, though acutely aware of Cromwell's machinations, found herself increasingly isolated. Her allies had been neutralized, some imprisoned, some bribed to remain silent, others cowed by fear. The Queen's own petition for justice, delivered in her firm and dignified voice, fell on deaf ears. Cromwell's narrative had captured the moral imagination of the realm. A queen betrayed her king and endangered the realm. In that dark winter of 1536, the reason held no sway. Any defence Anne mounted was drowned by the unrelenting tide of accusation and torment. As spring approached, the stage was set. Cromwell's dossier, now brimming with coerced confessions and circumstantial evidence, was presented to a jury of nobles who knew well that defiance would cost them far more than silence. In the Great Hall of Westminster, the formalities of a trial were observed: the reading of charges, the testimonies of the coerced, Anne's spirited rebuttal, but the outcome was never in doubt. Cromwell's careful curation had created the appearance of a thorough legal process, while in reality it was a meticulously rehearsed performance. When the unanimous verdict of guilty was delivered, a hushed consensus rippled through the assembled lords. And so, in the wan light before dawn, on a fateful May morning, Anne Boleyn's fate was sealed. Cromwell's campaign of deceit and cruelty had triumphed. The Queen, once the centre of Henry's world, now stood condemned by the very law that Cromwell had twisted to his ends. As the final preparations for the execution were made, Cromwell looked on with impassive calm, the consummate architect of justice turned weapon of royal will. In the aftermath, as Henry married again, and the promise of a male heir once more glimpsed on the horizon, Cromwell's name remained, whispered in both admiration and fear. His campaign against Anne Boleyn was not merely the fall of a queen, it was a masterclass in political warfare, the ultimate assertion that in Tudor England, power answered to no higher law than the king's own desire. On the 1st of May in 1536, the sun shone weakly over Greenwich as the jousting tournament commenced. Queen Anne Boleyn arrived in a gown of sumptuous velvet and silk, the embroidery catching what little light there was. But her face betrayed a taut anxiety that none of the assembled courtiers could miss. Beneath the ornate finery lay a woman quietly bracing herself against an invisible storm. The cheers of the crowd, the clashing of lances, and the thunder of hooves seemed distant to Anne's keen ears. She moved through the throng with a measured grace, yet every step felt weighted by the knowledge that her world had begun to unravel. Just days after that ill-omened display, in the hush before dawn on the 6th of May, Anne was seized in secret. Guards, stern-faced and silent, entered her private chambers under Cromwell's orders and led her away, her silken skirts whispering on the cold stones. No alarms were raised, no outcry followed. It was as though the very air had conspired to hush her departure. She was hurried to the Tower of London, the ancient fortress that loomed dark and heavy at the heart of the city. There, she was thrust into isolation, her attendants dismissed, her family kept at a distance, and any hope of legal counsel firmly denied. The days merged into one another as she waited in shadowed rooms, never knowing when or on what charges she would be tried. On the 12th of May, The same grim spectacle began for her condemned friends. At Tower Hill, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and Mark Smeaton were brought forth, shackled and gaunt from their weeks in confinement. They stood before the assembled crowd, as accusations were read aloud in the language of betrayal, adultery with the Queen, plotting regicide, and conspiring to elevate Anne to the throne. Their sentences were cruelly precise, hanging bottomest, drawing, and quartering for the men of lesser birth, while George Boleyn, Anne's own brother and a nobleman, was granted the dubious mercy of the sword. The proclamations, dripping with contempt, painted these men as monsters who would dare slay their sovereign to secure the Queen's hand. It was a grotesque parody of justice. Despite the absence of any tangible proof, no letters, nor lovers' tokens, and certainly no eyewitness accounts. Public sentiment had already been swayed. Smeaton's tortured confession, extracted under Cromwell's relentless interrogation, was treated as gospel, and the other men, isolated and starved of hope, were easy prey. Cold wind scattered papers across the scaffold as the crow's cries echoed in the brittle spring air. Each man's final moments were drawn out for the watching multitudes, the snap of the trapdoor, the twitch of a body straining at its noose, and then the savage spectacle of quartering. Limbs severed before a hushed but horrified audience. George's decapitation, while swift in theory, nonetheless carried a ghastly weight as his head fell, rolling in the muddy earth. From the dank confines of the tower, Anne would have heard the distant echoes of the executions, the creaking gallows, the clatter of the executioner's axe, and the agonized cries of the condemned. Her heart, once buoyed by ambition and the promise of power, now lay shattered by grief and betrayal. The reverberations of that day's brutality were not simply physical. They shredded the very fabric of her soul. She was forced to bear witness to the destruction of those she had come to trust, their deaths serving as a grim prelude to her own. The public display of carnage was intended to cow any who might still harbour sympathy for her or defiance of the King's will. In those dreadful hours, the people of London watched in a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. Mothers pulled their children close, convinced that such horrors were a just lesson in obedience, while merchants and artisans averted their eyes, whispering prayers that they might never face such a fate. The message was clear. Even the most exalted woman, the King's own chosen partner, could be cast down without recourse. Cromwell's masterstroke lay not only in the physical executions but in the psychological terror it wrought. By parading the severed bodies and publicising the charges, he laid the groundwork for Anne's own trial, ensuring that the populace would view her as the ringleader of betrayal rather than its victim. Every whispered rumour in the corridors of Westminster would carry the weight of that savage display. When Anne's turn came, the verdict was preordained. The evidence, as flimsy as it was, had already been seared into the collective imagination. The executions of Norris, Brereton, Weston, Smeaton, and George Boleyn had set the tone, a court of spectacle rather than justice. The Queen's trial was destined to be a final act in a grotesque theatre of power. Anne's final weeks in the Tower passed in a haze of sleepless nights and meagre meals. Her attendants, once so numerous, dwindled to a handful of loyal ladies whose presence offered scant comfort. The days blurred into one long twilight as she awaited the inevitable. Outside, the city resumed its rhythms, markets opened, churches tolled their bells, and life crept forward as though nothing so horrible had occurred. Yet for Anne, time had slowed. Each breath felt borrowed, and each heartbeat echoed the cries she had heard on Tower Hill. When at last the summons came, she dressed in her grey silk gown and white coif, the same attire that marked her final transformation from queen to condemned. The corridor she walked was lined with guards, their armor clinking softly, and in her heart she carried the memories of those who had fallen before her. As she approached the scaffold, the faintest breeze stirred the hem of her gown, and she caught a final glimpse of the Thames, glinting like a ribbon of silver in the gathering dusk. In those last moments, Anne's composure never wavered. She knelt on the straw-strewn platform, her voice firm as she offered prayers for her own soul and forgiveness for her enemies. And with the clang of the executioner's sword, her life was severed from its mortal coil, an abrupt punctuation to a story writ large in ambition and tragedy. The blood that stained the boards beneath her seemed to cry out that no justice was served. Only the final assertion of power, unbound by mercy. In the hushed aftermath, as the crowds dispersed and the night reclaimed the tower, the true cost of Henry's decisive will was laid bare. Not merely the end of a queen, but the beginning of an age, defined by ruthless authority and irrevocable loss. On the 15th of May, 1536, the hall of the Tower of London was hushed as Anne Boleyn entered in the simple black morning gown she had chosen for this final appearance. Her dark dress, free of any embroidery or jewels, contrasted sharply with the white coif that bound her hair neatly at the nape of her neck. She walked with a quiet dignity, her head held high, as though she bore not shame but the weight of unwavering conviction. When she reached the centre of the chamber, she paused, glanced at the judges arrayed before her 26 lords and noblemen, all of whom had long known the verdict they were expected to deliver, and removed her gloves in a single, deliberate motion. "Your lordships," she began, her voice steady yet soft. "I have never wronged the king, neither in word nor in deed." There was no tremor in her tone, only the measured cadence of someone accustomed to command. Behind her, the heavy doors were closed, sealing her off from any comfort or counsel she might once have known. No defense counsel stood at her side. No witnesses waited to affirm her innocence. Only the echo of her own statement reverberated through the dimly lit hall. The judges watched impassively, their faces set in stone, for they had been chosen and briefed long before to satisfy the king's will. The proceedings unfolded swiftly, almost mechanically. The charges, adultery, incest, and high treason were recited in formal language that might once have carried weight, but here sounded like the recitation of a script written by Cromwell's hand. Witness statements were read, a letter torn into fragments, a friendly embrace at court, the merest whisper of impropriety. Each was offered as proof, though each had been extracted under duress or misrepresentation. Anne's pleas to call credible witnesses fell on deaf ears. Her protests of innocence were met with polite but unyielding dismissal. The judges conferred in muted tones, consulted each other briefly, and then delivered the unanimous verdict she had known was inevitable. No applause followed the declaration. Instead, a solemn stillness descended as the sentence was pronounced, death by decapitation. Anne's heart must have weighed heavy in her chest as the words fell, for she had long since learned that once the king's mind was made up, no amount of innocence would avail. She bowed her head slightly, acknowledging the sentence with a grace that spoke of her resolve. They informed her that the execution would take place at noon on the 19th of May, just 4 days. Hence a detail that seemed both relief and torment, for it gave her time to prepare, and yet stretched the interminable wait into an endless corridor of dread. During those final 2 days, Anne conducted herself with a serenity that belied the horror of her fate. She refused the customary final meal, saying that bread and water would suffice. She spent hours writing letters, one to her daughter Elizabeth, the innocent child whose future now lay in uncertain hands, others to friends and law servants, offering words of encouragement and gratitude for their steadfastness. When not writing, she knelt in prayer. Her whispered petitions carried on the cold air of the tower's private chapel. Here attendants, though few, witnessed her composure and found themselves moved to tears by her calm acceptance. Even in those moments of quiet reflection, she prepared herself for what lay ahead. Each breath, a step closer to the final act. At dawn on the 19th of May, Anne was awakened gently, dressed in the same black gown, and led from her chambers to the green before the tower. The morning mist clung to the air, and the banners of sorrow were already raised, their dark folds snapping softly in the breeze. A simple wooden scaffold had been erected, its planks bare and unadorned, and beside it stood the French executioner, his sword gleaming faintly in the pale light. The contrast between the simple elegance of Anne's attire and the stark cruelty of the instruments of death was striking. A queen who had once worn the crown of England now stood before the blade that would sever her from life. As she approached the scaffold, Anne paused and removed her white coif, revealing the slender column of her neck once admired by Henry, now laid bare for the final act. She knelt with measured calm, folded her hands upon her lap, and turned her gaze upward. "Pray for the king," she said, her voice soft but clear, "and for the salvation of my own soul." Those were her final words, a gentle benediction that spoke more of mercy than any plea for mercy she might have uttered. The executioner nodded, and in a single swift motion, the sword descended. There was no struggle, no cry, only the quiet thud of steel upon flesh, and the soft rustle of her gown settling to rest on the scaffold. For a moment, the morning air seemed to hold its breath, as though the world itself mourned the passing of the woman who had, in life, both inspired devotion and provoked enmity. Her body was placed in a hastily prepared chest, a wooden coffer meant for war engines rather than for human remains, and carried back into the tower. There was no grand funeral, no ornate procession. Instead, she was laid to rest in an unmarked grave within the grounds, her identity concealed even in death. Thus ended the life of Anne Boleyn, from ambitious queen to condemned woman. Her story closed with a final gesture of ruthless efficiency. As the crowd dispersed and the morning sun burned away the mist, the tower stood silent witness to the irreversible passage of power. Anne's death had fulfilled its grim purpose to reinforce the king's supremacy, and to warn that no one, no matter how exalted, could defy his will without cost. Yet in that same silence lay the echo of her defiance, a quiet testament to a woman who faced her end with an unbroken spirit. The chapters of her life, marked by love, ambition, and betrayal, closed in that pale May morning, leaving behind a legacy as cold and clear as the sword that had severed her fate. Just 11 days later, Henry VIII quietly married Jane Seymour, a gentle former lady-in-waiting whose soft manners and steadfast loyalty offered precisely what Anne Boleyn had: not a wife who would bear a male heir without ever questioning royal authority. It was a hasty, almost furtive ceremony held in the privacy of Whitehall Palace, attended by only a handful of witnesses who had just days before condemned Anne to death. Many who watched from the shadows whispered in disbelief, for it seemed to them that Henry had discarded one queen with feverish rapidity in order to secure another. Across Europe, the reaction was one of horror and condemnation. The French court, still smarting from the political implications of Anne's execution, decried Henry's actions as callous and unjust. The imperial court of Charles V, the very emperor who was Anne's nephew, labelled Henry a tyrant, a ruler who would sacrifice justice and decency for dynastic ambition. Charles's ambassadors in London penned scathing dispatches, accusing Henry of fabricating charges and perverting the course of justice to satisfy his personal whims. Meanwhile, the Pope himself, Clement VII, steadfastly refused to recognize the new marriage. Yet with the Act of Supremacy freshly enacted, Henry had declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, rendering papal decrees impotent within his realm. Thus, England found itself increasingly isolated. Trade agreements stalled as foreign merchants hesitated to dock in ports subject to a capricious monarch. Diplomatic envoys arrived with cautious reticence, their letters of credence ever more circumspect in praising the English crown. Noble families across the continent, once eager to secure alliances through dynastic marriage, paused, unwilling to risk their own reputations on a court where the king's favour could shift as suddenly as the wind. At home, opinion lay fractured. Some senior peers, unsettled by the king's moral pliability, grumbled in private antechambers, but dared not speak against the monarch's will in public. Others, ever mindful of the rewards that loyalty to Henry could bring, land grants, titles, lucrative offices, bent their hearts to acceptance, even if grudgingly. The common folk, far from the intrigues of high politics, murmured about the unsettling speed of these changes. Tales spread of clergy forced to swear new oaths of allegiance and parish records rewritten to remove references to papal authority. The very fabric of English society seemed to tremble under the weight of these upheavals. Yet amid this uncertainty, Jane Seymour enjoyed a brief respite. In October 1537, she bore Henry's long-awaited son, Edward. For a fleeting moment, the court rejoiced a true prince at last to secure the Tudor line. Fulfilling the king's deepest desire, Jane was hailed as the perfect queen, the gentle mother who would bear the heir and then gracefully withdraw into the background. Her health, already delicate from the perils of childbirth in that age, failed her bitterly. Within 12 days of Edward's birth, Jane succumbed to postpartum complications, hemorrhage that could not be staunched by the crude medicines and prayers of the Tudor court. Henry's grief was raw and genuine. In his massive, echoing chambers, he kept vigil by her bedside, weeping like a man undone. For once, his iron will seemed softened by sorrow. Yet his mourning only heightened Jane's posthumous reputation as the ideal queen, one who had given him exactly what he desired, only to fall before she could ever disappoint. In death, she occupied the pure image Henry longed to project: dutiful, unambitious, and fleetingly perfect. So ended Jane Seymour's brief tenure as queen, a life intertwined with dynastic salvation and swift, tragic departure. England, already reeling from religious schism and political isolation, now witnessed the cruel calculus of fate. One queen executed, another claimed by death's cold hand. Henry, solitary on his throne, remained determined to secure his legacy, while the realm around him shifted uneasily. Caught between the past he had shattered and the uncertain future he continued to shape. Though Anne Boleyn's life was cut tragically short, her legacy grew in magnitude long after her final breath. Her daughter, Elizabeth, ascended the throne as Elizabeth I at the tender age of 25 and went on to rule for 45 years, ushering in a golden age of literature, exploration, and cultural flourish. Under Elizabeth's reign, England became a leading power on the world stage. Her court, a beacon of artistic and intellectual achievement, in stark contrast, Anne's only son, Edward, inherited the throne as Edward VI, but died in early adolescence, leaving virtually no personal mark on history. Thus, the Tudor dynasty endured largely through Anne's bloodline via Elizabeth, establishing Anne as the true matriarch of subsequent monarchs. Henry VIII himself chose to be laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the queen who had borne his sole male heir. His funerary arrangements made no mention of Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, nor Anne Boleyn, the mother of his greatest triumph and his most harrowing downfall. In death, as in life, Henry emphasized his devotion to the male line over enduring romantic attachments. Just as he had prized the birth of Edward above all other desires, this final testament in stone and ceremony underscored the unyielding Tudor conviction that a son was paramount, transcending any love or loyalty once bestowed upon a wife. In the longer sweep of history, Anne's fateful decisions reshaped the political, religious, and ideological landscape of not only England, but all of Europe. By refusing to remain a mere mistress and insisting upon marriage, she catalyzed Henry's break with Rome and the papacy. His self-declaration as supreme head of the Church of England laid the legal and theological foundation for the Protestant Reformation on English soil. This rupture severed centuries of spiritual dependence on Roman authority and introduced the principle that monarchs derived their sovereignty directly from God rather than through ecclesiastical hierarchy. The ripples extended far beyond ecclesiastical schisms. The Act of Supremacy and subsequent religious reforms fostered centuries of debate over the nature of authority, governance, and individual conscience. The English model of a national church under the Crown influenced other Protestant movements across the continent. It accelerated the spread of vernacular scripture, encouraged literate lay participation in worship, and weakened the political power of medieval clergy. In every duel between king and pope that followed, England stood as precedent, its monarch no longer answerable to any foreign prelate. Moreover, Anne Boleyn exemplified the potential for women to wield intelligence, strategy, and political acumen in a male-dominated world. She demonstrated that a woman need not rely solely upon beauty or compliance to navigate court power structures. Her mastery of languages, her diplomatic skill, her ability to advise Henry on religious and state matters, all these qualities marked her as far more than a mere consort. Though tragic in outcome, her tenure as Queen Consort inspired subsequent figures from her daughter Elizabeth to Mary, Queen of Scots, and even Candlelit, to stateswomen like Margaret Thatcher. Each would, in turn, draw upon the notion that a woman's intellect and vision could shape the destiny of a nation. Of course, Anne paid the ultimate price for her boldness. In that grim shadow of the Tower, she learned that ambition and influence carried equally sharp blades. Yet it is precisely that paradox, her simultaneous vulnerability and power, that renders her story immortal. Anne Boleyn's life stands as a vivid testament to the fragility and potency of power, to the steep cost of ambition, and to the indomitable spirit of a woman confronting injustice. In her final moments, she knelt beneath the blade, her grace undimmed, even as her world collapsed. In death, she remained unbowed, her name etched forever into the chronicles of an England she helped remold. And so, as the years stretched into centuries, historians and storytellers returned again and again to Anne's saga. They pondered her cunning letters, her dazzling courtly presence, her defiance of papal edicts, and the cold intrigue that led to her demise. They saw in her life the collision of personal desire and political necessity, the way in which a single queen's fate could launch 1,000 reforms or condemn them. In every retelling, Anne emerges not merely as a cautionary figure or a footnote in Henry's matrimonial ledger, but as a woman whose choices set an island, nation ablaze with change. Sleepy though we might be, as we trace each twisting episode from the vibrant revelry of court to the rain-soaked scaffold on Tower Green, the echo of Anne's courage lingers. Across the centuries, her story whispers of daring and downfall, of fury and faith, of a world altered by one determined heart. And as our eyelids grow heavy, we remember that the power to compel kings, shape churches, and chart the course of history once rested in that slender figure draped in grey silk. In the hush of night, her legacy endures restless, radiant, and forever defiant. After Anne Boleyn's execution and Henry VIII's swift marriage to Jane Seymour, the Tudor court drifted into a deep and uneasy silence. Within the palace walls, those nobles who had once basked in the Queen's favour recoiled at the slightest sign of sympathy, a whispered compliment about Anne's wit, or a compassionate glance at a surviving token of her reign, risked being construed as disloyalty to the crown. Wealthy families scrambled to affirm their fealty to the new regime. They publicly denounced Anne, confiscated or destroyed her heraldry, and erased her name from tapestry and tomb alike. Even her garments, silken gowns embroidered with pomegranates, were unstitched and buried in unmarked pits, as though Henry sought to obliterate every trace of her existence. The grand house of roses that had once been Anne's refuge turned into a mausoleum of muted horror, with courtiers fearful that any sentimental remembrance might invite royal wrath. Among the common people, uncertainty reigned. In London's bustling markets and along the Thames embankments, rumours swirled like drifting fog. Street printers and coin engravers who dared to circulate satirical broadsheets were swiftly clapped into the dungeons. Yet the whisper of injustice persisted. Mothers told fearful children that the Queen had been betrayed by false testimony. Travelling preachers spoke of divine retribution for wrongful execution. And in dimly lit taverns, gentlemen exchanged furtive glances over their tankards of ale. In parish churches, pockets of unrest emerged. Some Catholic priests, still loyal to Rome, quietly sermonized on the cruelty of a king who would slay his own consort. They referred to Henry as the Director King, a tyrant who sacrificed beloved wives for political expediency, though the act of supremacy forbade open criticism of the monarch. Discontent hid in the hearts of many. England's grey dawns felt colder, as if the realm itself shivered under the weight of shame and regret. Politically, the palace grew more orderly for the king, yet stifling for debate. Debate, once invigorated by Anne's keen intellect, fell into abrupt recession. Senior courtiers and cabinet ministers spoke in hushed tones, mindful that championing any outspoken woman or any novel idea might invite accusations of sedition. Policy discussions, particularly on religious reform, retreated into secluded chambers. No longer did bishops and councillors gather boldly around the long table to argue scripture or statecraft. Instead, they conferred in secret corridors, their voices echoing off stone walls to avoid eavesdropping spies. The hush extended outward. Proclamations for ecclesiastical change were issued with minimal consultation, as though Henry preferred silent compliance to the spirited counsel Anne once inspired. The machinery of government, deprived of its most dynamic engine, creaked under the burden of caution and fear. In sum, Anne Boleyn's death rippled far beyond her own tragic end. It delivered a seismic shock to English governance and society. The people's faith in royal justice faltered. Commoners questioned whether any subject, however virtuous, could trust the courts. The nobility recoiled, ever vigilant that a misworded toast or a lingering glance at a fallen queen's memento might doom their lineage. And the very heart of politics, thoughtful discourse, robust debate. The clash of ideas retreated into shadow. England entered a time of muted suspicion, secret grievances, and unassailable royal authority. A single queen's downfall had tightened the crown's grip like never before, leaving the realm to ponder, in drowsy dread, how swiftly mercy could turn to massacre under the guise of law. In Europe, news of Anne Boleyn's execution and Henry VIII's secret marriage to Jane Seymour sent tremors through every royal court. In the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, publicly denounced Henry for wielding the death sentence like a political tool, putting a wife to death to install another in clear violation of church ethics and the traditions of European dynastic law. Diplomatic dispatches between the Vatican and the courts of Europe overflowed with outrage and appeals for Pope Clement VII to intervene. Yet dispute urgent entretien. The Pope's authority had been weakened by Henry's establishment of the Church of England. Decrees from Rome could no longer bind the English crown, and any hope of overturning the Queen's verdict proved illusory. Across the Channel in France, King Francois I had at first applauded England's break with Rome as a counterweight to Habsburg power. But the spectacle of a queen's beheading gave him pause. French ultramontane Catholics, Those most resolutely loyal to the papacy urged the court curtail trade and diplomatic ties with England, warning that the pattern of schism, slaughter, remarriage might destabilize the very moral foundations of European monarchy. French merchants found English cloth and wool subject to steeper duties, while Genoese and Burgundian intermediaries supplanted direct commerce. Envoys from Paris sent curt missives, extolling Catholic solidarity and hinting that any alliance with England now carried a taint of complicity in regicide. In the German principalities and the Swiss cantons, the upheaval became a cause célèbre for Protestant reformers. Lutherans in Saxony and Calvinists in Geneva hailed Henry's ruthless assertion of royal supremacy as proof that a sovereign could claim authority over both throne and altar. Pamphlets circulated in Nuremberg and Basel, interpreting Anne's fate as a cautionary tale of papal overreach and secular tyranny alike. Yet, even as they celebrated England's repudiation of Rome, they sounded a sober warning. Unchecked monarchical power could become as oppressive as any papal despotism. Exiled English humanists, Thomas More, among them, penned scathing treatises from the continent, branding Henry barbarous king and tyrant of the Thames, their words smuggled back into England by sympathetic traders. Beyond high politics, England suffered a palpable chill in its international standing. Betrothal treaties for princesses languished unsigned. Marriage negotiations for royal daughters were postponed indefinitely. Envoys from Spain, Venice, and Poland delayed audiences with the English court, fearful of incurring scandal by appearing too close to a regime that had so casually executed its queen. Papal nuncios visited London less frequently, their elaborate fueled carriages sidelined by distrust. This diplomatic isolation proved costly when Henry moved to dissolve the monasteries and seize their wealth. Continental investors balked at underwriting loans to the crown, forcing England to rely on smaller, less stable partners such as Portugal. Spain, once a natural ally through Catherine's bloodline, maintained a guarded distance until Queen Mary's restoration decades later. Yet the very schism that isolated England also enriched it. With the dissolution of abbeys and convents, Henry seized vast estates and treasure troves of silver and manuscripts. The expropriated revenues underwrote military expansions and shipbuilding programs that would, in time, establish English power at sea. The national coffers swelled, even as the court remained diplomatically hemmed in. Thus, Henry's policy became a double-edged sword abroad. His reputation lay in ruins and alliances frayed. At home, his grip on finance and domestic reform strengthened, enabling the crown to pursue a self-reliant, if precarious, path forward. Ultimately, Anne Boleyn's dramatic downfall illustrates the perilous interplay of personal ambition and statecraft. It cost England dearly in prestige and partnership. As Catholic courts recoiled, and Protestant states eyed England's model with both admiration and fear, yet it also cemented the Tudor monarchy's independence, precipitating a financial windfall that fueled religious and administrative transformation in the quiet hush that followed each courtly outcry. Henry VIII's England found itself both more isolated and more potent, an island sovereign determined to chart its own destiny, even at the cost of its queen, its alliances, and the moral authority of its monarch. One of the most enduring legacies of Anne Boleyn is her crucial role in advancing the English Protestant Reformation. Before Anne's arrival on the scene, Henry VIII remained outwardly loyal to Rome. He had even styled himself defender of the faith in a published treatise rebutting Martin Luther's arguments. Yet Anne, who had read and championed the works of northern theologians, subtly introduced the idea that the monarch's authority derived directly from God rather than through the Pope. In quiet conversations and private counsel, she urged Henry to see that breaking with Rome served not only his personal aims, annulment and remarriage, but also the broader institutionalization of national sovereignty. In Anne's mind, the Act of Supremacy would do more than free Henry. From papal control, it would birth a truly English church. Answerable first and foremost to the crown, by 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, formally recognising the king as supreme head of the Church of England. Almost simultaneously, canon law was abolished, and vast church lands and properties were confiscated. This seizure created a phenomenal influx of revenue into the royal coffers, funding Henry's court, his military ventures, and lavish building projects. Anne had helped to craft the intellectual framework for these sweeping reforms. Under her patronage, a circle of reform-minded bishops, theologians, and clerics drafted new regulations, revised liturgies, and fashioned a canon that reflected England's break with papal authority. Meanwhile, staunchly Catholic clerics who refused to acknowledge royal supremacy faced deprivation of office, imprisonment, or even execution. England's schism became a template for other northern European kingdoms. In Scandinavia, the monarchs of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden moved to nationalize former church wealth and declare themselves heads of national churches. In the various German principalities, Lutheran rulers similarly asserted that secular princes held authority over religious affairs within their realms. Yet the emerging Anglican model was unique in its retention of many traditional liturgical forms, alongside a rigorously centralized ecclesiastical hierarchy under the crown. This hybrid structure distinguished it clearly from more radically reformed Lutheran and Calvinist systems. Anne, though she did not live to see the full flowering of this new church, came to be remembered as the midwife of Anglicanism. The long-term consequences of Anne's theological and political interventions were profound. New Protestant movements, Puritan, evangelical, and later, more radical sects sprang up within England, challenging both the old Catholic hierarchy and sometimes even the established Anglican order. These tensions would later contribute to the convulsions of the 17th century English Civil War, as Parliament and Crown clashed over the very meaning of ecclesiastical authority. Under Queen Victoria, the principle of the monarch as church head evolved into the concept of a state-governed church, embedded in law rather than in direct royal decree. In more modern constitutional interpretations, the notion that the monarch has no spiritual head gave way to the idea that the government has no official religion, underpinning a fully secular state. Yet all these developments trace their origins back to the dramatic rupture in 1534, a rupture that would not have occurred without Anne's influence. Anne's contribution to religious thought also empowered English women in subtle ways. Her willingness to engage in theological debate, to support new translations of Scripture, and to champion learned women's involvement in religious discourse presaged later female figures such as Elizabeth I and even 17th century dissenters who would publish under pseudonyms. Though Anne's own fate was tragic, her example showed that women could wield intellectual and political authority in an age that typically relegated them to silence. Her brief tenure as Queen Consort paved the way for a more active female presence in matters of faith, a legacy that resonates in the stories of Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth I, and, much later, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who would stand at the very pinnacle of power in Britain. Ultimately, Anne Boleyn stands at the centre of a seismic transfer of religious power from Rome to London. The English Church's distinct identity, its pattern of liturgical continuity coupled with doctrinal reform, and the very idea that a monarch could preside over spiritual as well as temporal realms, all flow from the bold initiatives she helped to set in motion. Though she perished on the scaffold, the spiritual and political architecture she championed endures. Every Anglican bishop's oath, every modern statute safeguarding religious freedom, and every debate over the role of faith in public life carries echoes of Anne's restless spirit. In the hush that followed Henry's bitter triumphs, Anne's vision quietly took root. The Church of England became a living monument to her conviction that temporal rulers answer directly to God and not to any foreign potentate Her tragic story reminds us that the intertwining of personal ambition and religious principle can reshape nations. Anne Boleyn, the once mocked, courtly lady who dared to speak of scriptural sovereignty, remains a testament to the power of ideas and to the fragile humanity of those who dare to wield them. One of the most unexpected yet enduring legacies of Anne Boleyn lies not only in matters of church and state, but in the realm of women's rights. For centuries, her story has been retold as more than a cautionary tale of courtly intrigue or marital betrayal. It has become a foundational myth of female intellect and agency, a woman who dared to stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful man in England, wielding her wit and will to assert her own destiny. In our memory, sympathetic chroniclers saw not merely a tragic queen, but a prototype of the strategic, outspoken woman who would not be silenced or owned by her husband, her family, or her church. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as the first stirrings of organised feminism began to ripple through Britain, figures like Mary Wollstonecraft invoked Anne's example. In A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, Wollstonecraft argued that women possessed the capacity for reason equal to men, lamenting that social conventions too often reduced women to mere ornamental playthings. She pointed, although obliquely but unmistakably, to Anne Boleyn as proof that a woman of education and resolve could shape the course of empires. A century later, Emmeline Pankhurst and her suffragette compatriots resurrected Anne's memory in rallies and pamphlets, casting her as a martyr for marital equity. Pankhurst's banners proclaimed, "Had Anne Boleyn been allowed legal recourse against a false betrayal, perhaps she would not be the first queen to die on the scaffold." Such sentiments galvanized a generation of activists who saw in Anne's refusal to accept the status of property a precursor to their own demands for the vote and for legal protection from domestic tyranny. In the modern era, Anne Boleyn has been reimagined again and again, not as a one-dimensional schemer, but as a complex subject in her own right. 21st century biographies and films depict her as a woman, ahead of her time, fluent in theological debate, adept in diplomatic nuance, and entirely conscious that her personal fortunes were inseparable from the greater struggle for women's public voice. In theatre, she is portrayed delivering razor-sharp asides to Henry VIII, challenging not just his heart but his worldview. In novels, she is the anxious strategist, aware that every letter she writes might be intercepted. In academic studies of early modern queenship, she emerges as a savvy political partner, demanding to be consulted on matters of foreign policy and church governance. These portrayals underscore how Anne leveraged the same networks of patronage and persuasion that male courtiers employed, proving that political leadership need not be confined to men. Perhaps most resonant for contemporary audiences is the psychological dimension of Anne's ordeal. Stripped of her crown, condemned on charges known to be false, she faced the Tower of London's isolation and manipulative interrogations. Yet, accounts of her final days emphasize her composure. When offered the chance to beg mercy, she refused to plead for her life, at the cost of her integrity. In stoically kneeling before the executioner, she bestowed upon later generations an indelible image of feminine dignity under duress. To modern advocates against domestic violence and coercive control, Anne's steadfastness in the face of false accusations resonates deeply. She embodies the refusal to submit to abusive power, even when that power is invested in the very man whom she once called "my sovereign lord." Across the global arc of women's movements, Anne Boleyn has become something of a shorthand reference, the woman who got on her knees before the blade rather than before injustice. In workshops for survivors of intimate partner violence, trainers sometimes quote her final words, "Mine eyes are going blind." Guide thou my hand not to romanticize her death, but to highlight her agency in choosing how to face it. In university seminars on gender and religion, students debate her skillful, if dangerous, navigation of doctrinal disputes, framing her as an early architect of women's moral autonomy. Of course, Anne's legacy is not without tension. Some critics argue that celebrating her strategic ruthlessness risks valorizing ambition at the expense of solidarity. Others note that the very aristocratic privileges she commanded the education, the courtly position, the proximity to power were closed to most Tudor women. Yet even these critiques acknowledge that her brief reign unlocked questions about what a woman could accomplish if afforded the same intellectual tools as a man. Ultimately, Anne Boleyn's life story transcends its tragic denouement to become a cornerstone in the edifice of feminine memory. She was a queen who refused to be merely a passive vessel for dynastic continuity. She insisted on being a political interlocutor and a spiritual influencer. Her very existence challenged the legal and cultural norms that treated women as dependent and voiceless. In the centuries since her death, activists, scholars, and storytellers have drawn on her example to argue that women, too, can be thinkers, leaders, strategists, and moral authorities. And as the 21st century continues to grapple with questions of bodily autonomy, institutional trust, and the intersection of personal and political power, Anne's story retains its eerie power. In a world still facing debates over reproductive rights, marital consent laws, and the cloistering of women's voices, the image of Anne Boleyn standing proud before the executioner, refusing to apologize for her ambitions, remains unmistakably relevant. Her legacy reminds us that the struggle for women's full participation in public life is neither new nor confined to modern democracies. It stretches back through the corridors of power into the quiet chambers of medieval courts, and within those corridors, Anne's measured footsteps still echo. To this very day, the story of Anne Boleyn endures as both an epic saga and a tragedy of power, love, and the bitter price of ambition. Here was a young woman born into a modest, noble household who rose from the refined courts of France and the Netherlands to become the Queen of England, altering dynasties and ultimately catalyzing the English Reformation. Yet she was caught in the gears of the very political machine she helped set in motion, ensnared by a king's desires and a minister's machinations, and made a victim of the laws they themselves had fashioned. Power, as Anne's life so starkly reminds us, never stands still. It protects and elevates even as it undermines and destroys. Anne's feminine grace, her keen intellect, and her strategic acumen won her Henry's admiration and the crown, but those same qualities rendered her a valuable pawn in the deadly game of Tudor politics. Cromwell and Henry wielded laws and accusations like swords, and the Queen, who had once shaped their application, found herself on the receiving end of their blade. In Anne's fate we find a cautionary lesson for any wielder of power, man or woman, that the very instruments we forge to secure our position can turn upon us with equal force. And yet Anne Boleyn stands as living proof of the concurrent fragility and fortitude that define human ambition. She dared to reject the passive role prescribed to her sex and station, demanding that her marriage be founded on mutual respect, that her voice be heard in matters of state and church. In asserting her right to dignity and agency, she became a pioneer for women's participation in the highest spheres of public life. But her refusal to remain silent ultimately exacted the severest of tolls, her life itself. Today, women worldwide still face injustices in homes, workplaces, and courts where their bodies, voice, and choices are constrained or dismissed. Anne's story beckons us to remember that the path to equal standing, to the right to speak and be heeded, is fraught with obstacles that can be perilous. It is a path marked by struggle, by the forging and shattering of alliances, and by the ever-present risk that those who challenge entrenched authority may be crushed in return. Yet it is precisely that perilous journey that carves its way into history. Anne's life and death remind us that agency demands courage, resilience, and a willingness to stake everything, even one's very existence, on the conviction that one's cause is just and necessary. She ignited a spark that would blaze into one of the most profound, religious, political, and social transformations of her age. She showed that a single individual, however constrained by circumstance, can redirect the currents of power not just for herself, but for generations to come. So tonight, as the world outside grows quiet and the hours slip by, take a moment to honor Anne Boleyn, woman, queen, reformer, martyr. Remember the folds of her grey silk gown and the flash of the French sword that ended her story. Reflect on the irony that her greatest triumph, ushering in an independent Church of England, was born of her intimate struggle for respect and recognition. And know that, even a century later, her legacy casts a long shadow over our understanding of power, ambition, and the price exacted by those who refuse to be silent when night falls and all grows still. Spare a thought for Anne Boleyn, the woman who once lit the fire of a new church, of self-determination, and of an indomitable feminine will. The tragic saga of Anne Boleyn is not merely a sequence of shocking events, but also a mirror reflecting profound values and messages for viewers. First, on power and responsibility. Power is always a double-edged sword. It can lift us to the highest heights, but it can also drown us without warning. Anne Boleyn skillfully wielded her influence to transform a dynasty, initiate the English Reformation, and give millions the chance to cast off the shackles of religious constraint. Yet that very power, when wielded by Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell, became the tool that stole her freedom and her life. Viewers are reminded that whenever we hold power, it must be accompanied by a sense of responsibility, humanity, and humility. Second, on ambition and its price. Ambition can inspire us to reach higher, but when it lacks balance, it can spiral into reckless obsession. Anne dared to dream, dared to fight for a just marriage and for the power of a woman's mind. However, she paid the ultimate price with both her liberty and her life. The lesson here is that lofty goals must be pursued with clear judgment and a willingness to bear the consequences. We cannot blindly chase ambition at the expense of our conscience and compassion. Third, on resilience and adaptability. Within the Tudor, gilded prison rife with disease, violence, and covert surveillance, Anne maintained her dignity and resolve. She refused to bow before adversity, remained ever aware of her own worth, and continued to engage in governance and champion reform. This is a powerful reminder to anyone enduring suffering or despair. While we may not be able to change our circumstances, we can always preserve our faith